Mainstream archaeologists date the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid at Giza to 2500 BC, when they were built to honor the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty. Casey's date of 10,500 BC is dismissed by mainstream science, but a few researchers are coming forward, as Casey predicted, to support his unorthodox view.
I could see that in the geology lay the key to this total reversal of history.
John Anthony West is a self-described rogue Egyptologist. He believes that the pattern of erosion on the Sphinx rules out the mainstream date of 2500 BC.
In a nutshell, the theory is that the Sphinx has been weathered by water, and specifically by rain falling down over the plateau over many thousands of years. You look at the Sphinx and you see that it's this rounded profile with deep fissures going down the rock face. This can only be produced by rainfall falling over the plateau.
Rain erosion in the Sahara is impossible now. But before 10,000 BC, this part of Africa was a fertile grassland. So, West points out in his book, if the Sphinx has been eroded by water, it must date back before 10,000 BC. The same conclusion, using different evidence, has also been reached by authors Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock. Help us understand the mirror image of the monuments at Giza and the sky at certain points in time, because that's key to understanding the entire concept you're putting forward.
There is only one time where the image of the sky locks with the image on the ground. And this occurs, and only occurs, in 10,500 BC.
Bauval and Hancock have discovered that the Egyptian sky in 10,500 BC bears an uncanny resemblance to the layout of the monuments on the Giza Plateau.
10,500 BC, this is when the Sphinx is gazing directly at his own image, the constellation of Leo. And if we are to turn 90 degrees and face due south, we would see the 3 stars of Orion's belt in a pattern that mimics exactly the pattern of the pyramid on the ground. So we have here a perfect conjunction taking place only and only in 10,500 BC.
The Great Sphinx of Giza is one of the globe's most recognizable monuments. Standing 66 feet high and some 240 feet long, constructed of limestone blocks weighing up to 200 tons, it is by far the largest sculpture of the ancient world. It is perhaps also its most enigmatic and mysterious. To this day, experts are unsure about the origin and purpose of the Sphinx, about who created it, whose face adorns it, and what secrets it might be hiding. In ancient times, the Giza Plateau, on which the Sphinx rests, was known as Rostau, which means the mouth of passages. To understand the mysteries of the Sphinx, one might ask, what passages, and to where? On February 16, 1923, archaeologists in Egypt discovered the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, more commonly referred to as King Tut, which had been undisturbed for more than 3,000 years prior. The magnitude of the discovery ensured widespread acclaim for the story all across the world and subsequently led to a surge of archaeologists and amateur treasure hunters descending on Egypt. By the 1930s, countless new discoveries had been made, but perhaps the most incredible was yet to come. In 1935, a massive decade-long clearing project in Giza finally reached its conclusion, and what it revealed shocked the world. One of the leaders of the project, Hamilton M. Wright, described the findings. We have discovered a subway used by the ancient Egyptians of 5,000 years ago. It passes beneath the causeway leading between the second pyramid and the Sphinx. From this subway, we have unearthed a series of shafts leading down more than 125 feet, with roomy courts and side chambers. It appeared Wright and his team had discovered some sort of secret city under the Giza Plateau. For the rest of that year, articles and stories appeared in academic journals and across mainstream news, detailing further findings, buildings and hallways and walls, vertical stone support columns, even delicate stonework carvings, and pastel-painted art, all hidden beneath the ground. Photographs of this underground city were taken and shown to various experts who were, in the words of one Egyptologist, deeply impressed. And then, suddenly and without warning, the story disappeared. Media coverage stopped, and Egyptian authorities diverted attention to new initiatives, while archaeologists shifted their focus to the tombs and treasures which have come to define Egyptology. In the 5th century BCE, Greek historian Herodotus wrote his seminal work, The Histories, known as the founding work of history in Western literature. Within it, he described a journey he had taken to Egypt where, he asserted, he had been shown the legendary Labyrinth of Egypt. According to lore, the Labyrinth was a hidden underground complex which contained a mythical hall of records comprising all the lost knowledge of the ancients compiled before the Great Flood. Of his purported journey to the underground labyrinth, Herodotus wrote, "There I saw 12 palaces regularly disposed, which had communication with each other, interspersed with terraces and arranged around 12 halls. It is hard to believe they are the work of man. The baffling and intricate passages from room to room and from court to court were an endless wonder to me, as we passed from a courtyard into rooms, from rooms into galleries, from galleries into more rooms, and thence into yet more courtyards. The roof of every chamber, courtyard, and gallery is like the walls of stone. The walls are covered with carved figures, and each court is exquisitely built of white marble and surrounded by a colonnade. Near the corner where the labyrinth ends, there is a pyramid, 240 feet in height, with great carved figures of animals on it, and an underground passage by which it can be entered. I was told very credibly that underground chambers and passages connected this pyramid with the pyramids at Memphis." Herodotus was far from the only prominent thinker among the ancients to speak of an underground world in Egypt. 1st century Greek philosopher Strabo also claimed to have visited the labyrinth, which he called a great palace composed of many palaces, as did his contemporary, the Roman author Pliny the Elder, who wrote of the bewildering maze of paths that made up the underground complex. At around the same time, Greek historian Diodorus provided a sumptuous description of the labyrinth's majesty. When one had entered the sacred enclosure, one found a temple surrounded by columns, 40 to each side, and this building had a roof made of a single stone, carved with panels and richly adorned with excellent paintings. It contained memorials of the homeland of each of the kings, as well as of the temples and sacrifices carried out in it, all skillfully worked in paintings of the greatest beauty. But stories of the secrets which Egypt held beneath the desert sands did not stop with accounts of the labyrinth. In the 4th century, Syrian philosopher Iamblichus recorded information on an underground tunnel system beneath Giza, accessed through the body of the Sphinx. As he wrote, "This entrance, obstructed in our day by sands and rubbish, may still be traced between the forelegs of the crouched colossus. It was formerly closed by a bronze gate whose secret spring could be operated only by the Magi. It was guarded by public respect, and a sort of religious fear maintained its inviolability, better than armed protection would have done. In the belly of the Sphinx were cut-out galleries leading to the subterranean part of the Great Pyramid. These galleries were so artfully crisscrossed along their course to the pyramid that, in setting forth into the passage without a guide throughout this network, one ceasingly and inevitably returned to the starting point." Even more incredibly, according to 10th century Arab historian Masudi, these subterranean galleries contained written accounts of wisdom and acquirements in the different arts and science, which were hidden deep, that they might remain as records for those who could afterwards comprehend them. Could any of this, all of this, be true? And if not, why do so many historical figures speak of it? Moreover, why have all these stories been forgotten or ignored in modern times? Remember the words of Jerry Cannon, who said, "They're frightened that if they find stuff under there, it's going to blow all their books and all their history out of the window." So what secrets are they hiding? And how will these secrets fundamentally alter our understanding of human history? Return to the research of West and Schoch in the early 1990s. A series of underground chambers and tunnels was not the only thing they discovered. Vitally, they also determined through a geological survey something amazing about the age of the Sphinx. To that point, mainstream thought had placed the age of the Sphinx at about 4,500 years old from the dynasty of Khufu, around 2500 BC. Yet West and Schoch found that erosion showed the Sphinx had been carved far before that, back before the Sahara even became a desert, at the end of the last ice age, when heavy rains constantly pounded the area. This meant that the Sphinx was not 4,500 years old, but over 10,000. It may be mentioned this was just as Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, had predicted. Interestingly, the ancient Egyptians have no record of the Sphinx being built. In fact, an ancient Egyptian tablet found in the 1850s called the Inventory Stela seems to indicate that Khufu did not build a Sphinx, but rather he only repaired it, meaning it was in existence before his reign. Moreover, as authors Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval point out, the Sphinx is aligned with the Great Pyramids and the Nile River in a way which mirrors the orientation of the stars. Except they do not mirror the stars today, but rather where the stars would have been approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. If the Sphinx really is over 10,000 years old, this would mean that it predates the ancient Egyptians. That long ago, it was the Sumerians who stood as the dominant group in the region. According to ancient Sumerian texts, their civilization was visited by gods from the sky called the Anunnaki, who brought them advanced technology and knowledge, spurring their development and, in fact, the development of all humanity. In modern times, there are many who believe these gods were not deities at all, but rather ancient aliens who came to mine gold from our planet. But how does this relate to the Sphinx, and what may or may not be hidden beneath it? Consider, ancient Sumerian texts reveal that the Anunnaki built massive cities underground, and to enter these underground metropolises, one entered through a tunnel, its entrance hidden by sand and by what they call Hawana, his teeth as the teeth of a dragon, his face the face of a lion. This sounds almost as though the Anunnaki constructed some sort of lion-like sphinx to guard their secret underground abode. Return to the words of Masudi, who claimed to have seen the hidden tunnels and galleries under Giza in the 10th century. In his work, he wrote that these tunnels and galleries were guarded by mechanical statues with amazing capabilities, the description of which sounded not unlike robots in modern science fiction. I have seen things that one does not describe for fear of making people doubt one's intelligence, Masudi proclaimed, but I still have seen them.
In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte's troops arrived in Egypt and were amazed by the large buildings that were found there. Among them, there was the Great Sphinx, showing its imposing imperialism to those men who missed that very different and extravagant culture. The Sphinx was half buried in the desert, but even then the world was captivated by its charm. It was not until 1936, that the mission carried out by the French Émile Baguettes dug up that great structure that had been covered by the sand path for millennia. A prophet of the time was the one who alerted the world, declaring that he had had a vision under hypnosis in which he was shown inside the Sphinx of Egypt. In this was the great ancient library, which guarded the ancient knowledge and, among them, the findings of Atlantis. According to Edgar, the prophet would be the pyramids, the Sphinx and other buildings, replicas of the submerged Atlantis. In 1987, a team from the Japanese University of Waseda discovered tunnels and cameras inside the Sphinx. This shook the Egyptologists, though it was later said that such passageways, strangely, led nowhere. Since then it has been covered with a halo of mystery to the Great Sphinx. But the truth is that the thing does not end here. The team found, thanks to a study of electromagnetic sound waves, entries in the legs of the Sphinx, as well as a cavity in the very head of the Sphinx. As an entrance, this cavity, which had been described by Napoleon, was photographed from the air at the beginning of the 20th century. Although at the end of it, with reasons for the restoration of the head, the peculiar finding was ended, plugging this and other cavities in the structural base. A recreation that Charles Russell made in 1914, showed the inside of the Sphinx. In the illustration, the entrance to the Sphinx could be observed through the cavity of the head, which led to a camera and went down to the main room of the Sphinx. This, in turn, housed several passages that led to other areas outside the Sphinx. And below it, a pyramid. A pyramid that would house the pharaoh of the first Egyptian dynasty, which would be Pharaoh Menes, chosen by the gods to rule on earth and who would have been represented on the face of the Great Sphinx. This news was also published on the cover a year earlier, in the British newspaper The Sphere, published on March 22, 1913, where you could see the same description that Charles Russell did. But it was not the only publication that sold in the media this finding. A year later, on March 5, 1914, the Australian newspaper Northern Territory Times published a column in an article detailing that discovery. Right on the dates when the mysterious entrance to one of the most fascinating structures of humanity was discovered.
We are here with Robert Schoch. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself for those who don't know?
Sure, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here, number one. And some people may know me from my work on the Great Sphinx in Egypt, but just to sort of start with a little bit of introduction, I am a geologist. I received my PhD in geology and geophysics at Yale University back in 1983. I hate to admit it was so long ago, so that really dates me. And I've been teaching at Boston University full-time for the last 30 years, since 1984. My research has spanned a number of areas, from pure geology and stratigraphy and paleontology, that is fossils. I worked on fossil mammals for part of my dissertation at Yale. But what I'm most known for, I suppose, in the general public is my work of the last 25 years studying ancient civilizations. And in particular, I started with Egypt. I first became involved in the study of the Great Sphinx back in 1989, 1990. And what I was brought in to do, and this was through my colleague and now good friend, John Anthony West, in the last 25 years, but he first met me in 1989 or thereabouts, introduced me to the problem of the age of the Great Sphinx in 1990, specifically to look at the Great Sphinx from a geological point of view. The traditional Egyptologists consider the Great Sphinx, this, some people say, the most tremendous monument, the most tremendous sculpture on Earth, carved from the limestone bedrock on the Giza Plateau. They considered it to be 2500 BC, to date from 2500 BC approximately, and furthermore, that it was carved from scratch at that time. There were no predecessors, should we say, to the Great Sphinx. I went to look at it from a geological point of view to see if, in fact, this made sense. Looking at the bedrock geology, looking at the weathering, looking at the erosion, and to make a long story short, I very quickly found that the geological the weathering on the body of the Sphinx in particular did not match the 2500 BC date. What I mean by that is that the body of the Sphinx is carved down into the bedrock. Only the head stands above the general level of the plateau. And I'll say now, the head is recarved, so it's not the original head on the Great Sphinx. The body is what you have to look at, and the walls of what are known as the Sphinx enclosure, these are heavily weathered by rain, by precipitation, by rain falling down, running off the sides. You can see that in the way the layers have sort of what I call rolling or undulating profile. They have deep vertical fissures. And I want to say right now that sometimes people say, well, maybe it was rising Nile floods. No, it's not rising Nile floods. That would give a different geological signature. This is from rain beating down. The problem is, for the Egyptological dating of 2500 BC, that the Sahara has been the Sahara Desert hyper-arid for the last 5,000 years, from at least about 3000 BC. So there was an incompatibility, I noticed right away, in what we see on the Sphinx, the body of the Sphinx, its layers of rock, which were weathered very definitively, in a manner that was not compatible with the last 5,000 years of climatic history in North Africa and the Sahara Desert in particular. So this suggested to me almost immediately on my first trip that there was something amiss here, that there was something earlier than the Great Sphinx as we see it now, with a human head and a lion body, and that in fact the core body, what I call the core body of the Great Sphinx, goes back to an earlier period, and not just a few centuries, but based on the level of weathering, based on the climatic regime, had to go back at least a few thousand years. So that was the beginning. We did seismic studies. I worked with geophysicist Thomas Gobekli. We did low-energy seismic around the Sphinx and on the Giza Plateau. This too confirmed that the weathering around the base of the Sphinx was much deeper than would be expected for 2500 BC if it had been carved that geologically that recently. I looked at other aspects of the structure of not just the Sphinx, but was known as the Sphinx Temple. The Sphinx Temple sits just due east of the Sphinx and is built out of huge multi-ton, some of them tens of tons, limestone blocks that were in fact carved when the body of the Sphinx was carved. So they carved out these huge blocks, moved them just slightly due east to build the Sphinx Temple. Looked at that, looked at weathering of that, looked at repairs that were carried out in the 4th dynasty, circa 23 to 2500 BC. You find that there are repairs on the Sphinx, circa 23 to 24 or so 100 BC. Again, all of this data was incompatible with the Sphinx having initially been carved in 2500 BC. So the bottom line was, and I first presented this to the Geological Society of America, my fellow geologists, the bottom line was that the core body, the oldest portions of the Sphinx, go back to a much earlier period. And I found that the head was recarved. It is a dynastic head, but if you look at the Sphinx, the head is too small for the body. It's out of proportion. What I believe was the case is that it was probably a male lion originally. That's my speculation. The head became highly eroded. They recarved it in dynastic times into a human head. The body, instead of trying to recarve it, if you look at the Sphinx now, it's covered with small limestone blocks in places. Some of these go back to Old Kingdom times, that is 23 to 25 or so 100 BC. They were repairing the very ancient weathering. They did the same with the temple in front of it. So what I really feel I opened up was a new chapter, if you would, an older chapter of activity, human activity on the Giza Plateau, beginning with we'll call it a proto-sphinx, a structure that was there along with the temple that was associated with it. So I thought this was great. This would extend Egyptian history back before classical dynastic times. What I wasn't prepared for when I first started talking about this and presenting it at conferences in the early 1990s is that the Egyptologists in particular, they were livid. They were absolutely livid. The archaeologists were livid. They told me that this was absolutely impossible. They said that civilization didn't go back that far. Civilization only went back about 5, maybe 6,000 years at the most. People were hunter-gatherers. They couldn't build stone sculptures. They couldn't build monumental structures, that I must be crazy, that I was a pseudoscientist. I mean, they were really calling me nasty names. They accused me of saying that aliens from Mars or who knows what built the pyramids, and I wasn't even talking about the pyramids.